The proliferation of reactive load boxes to tame tube amplifiers would have to be one of my favorite things about being a guitar player in 2025. The fact that I can take the tone of my Marshall or Boogie in its sweet spot and scale it down to absolute silence while retaining the authentic amp and speaker interaction is about the closest thing to magic that you can get. I really wish I had access to load boxes when I was a young guitar player, because I definitely damaged my hearing playing way too loud through speaker cabinets. I definitely made myself very unpopular in the house and in the neighborhood. So what I want to do is have a look at two of the most widely available and popular load boxes today, the 2Notes Torpedo Captor X. Big thank you to friend of the channel and podcast co-host Troy Nababan for letting me borrow his Captor X. If you can see on the front panel here, you have a pretty simple control set on there. You've got an output level, you've got a voicing control, which is basically going to sweep between a mid-focused and a mid-scoop tone on there. You've got a space control, a 6-way preset switch, a high and a low switch, and then a headphone out. Then on the back, you have a pair of XLR outputs, a speaker in, a speaker through, and a 3-way attenuation switch on there. This one does require power to work. The other one is the new Boss Waza Tube Amp Expander Core. This is a streamlined version of their Tube Amp Expander. This one has a very similar control set on the front. You can select your different rigs or your different presets on there. There is a 2-way switch on here to select between two different reactive load settings, stack and combo. Similarly to the space control on the Captor, you've got this air control over here. You've got a line out and a speaker out level because this has a 30-watt power amp in it. And around the back, similarly, you've got a pair of XLR outputs. You've got a speaker input with 3 different settings, 100 watts, 50 watts, and 10 watts. You've got MIDI and a USB-C connection. The Captor X also has a MIDI connection and a USB connection on there. Then you've got a little add-on for the Boss Bluetooth dongle. That is an optional extra on there. And you've got an effects loop. So these can both act as reactive load boxes to replace a guitar speaker cabinet, and they can both load up speaker simulations on here. That's the way I really want to compare them side by side today. There's obviously some extra functions in here, like the attenuation in the Captor X. There is the effects loop and the built-in power amp in here so that you can use this to either load down your really loud amp and then reamplify it, or maybe take an underpowered amp and make it louder on there. Furthermore, you've got headphone outputs on here, and both of these work really well if you want to use your tube amp silently. We're also going to take a look at some of the built-in effects and extra features that you can access by their respective software editors. So let's grab a guitar, an amp, and let's go. To begin, I want to give you an idea of what it is like to use these two units as standalone pieces of hardware. I'm going to be playing a 1990 Les Paul Custom into my 1979 Marshall. I'm not going to touch the settings on the amp at all, so any differences that you hear are going to be coming from the respective impedance characteristics of the load boxes and any extra features that we explore in them. We're going to start with the Waza Tube Amp Expander. I have my free Cab IR loaded up in it. If you want to grab that one, it is in the video description. There's nothing else happening there. This is just load box and unfiltered IR. I'm going to start by swapping between the two different impedance curve options on here, stack and combo. We will start out with stack, and then I'll just flick back and forth between them. The other parameter that I'm going to tweak on here is the air parameter. This is going to add a room style reverb to everything. That's essentially going to take the overall directness out of the sound, add a bit of depth and space to everything, but we will start with that all the way down. goes a long way with that air control. I rarely find myself running it above 9 o'clock on there. We could also hear the different characteristics between the two different impedance curves on there. The stack has a much thicker, chunkier low end. It makes me want to play low power chords and do palm mutes on there. It feels really good with some gain like we've got at the moment. The combo is a little more open sounding. It's got a leaner low end, but it's got some really nice aggression in the upper mid range and high end on there. I kind of like that more for those open chords on there. And this is just something that you can use to tailor the sound of your rig. Clearly the thinking is, hey, if you're used to playing a Marshall or a Boogie, you're probably used to running that through a 4x12. So set it on stack and don't think about it. And similarly, if you're using a deluxe reverb or an AC30, the combo impedance curve is probably going to give you the authentic behavior that you're going to get out of your amp. From there, if you're using this, you just go in and program a bunch of presets with the software so that you can switch between different rigs and you can change the different built-in speaker and mic combinations. You can change the IRs, you can add effects in there. There's compression, reverb, delay, and EQ in there. What I like doing is just having a totally dry preset like we've got it at the moment, so the air all the way down. Then I'd have a preset where I just add a bit of plate style reverb and a preset where I add some delay, some post EQ, and a slightly larger reverb. So let's just hear the three of those. We'll take a look at the features that the software will let you add in just a little bit, but for now I just really wanted to compare how the units work as a piece of hardware on there. So with the Boss, pick your impedance curve. You want to add a little bit of air on there to give it some space, and then just change your pre-programmed rigs on there. You've got instant access to 10 of them on there. Let's go over to the Captor now, but before we do that, I want to compare the sound of the impedance curve or the reactive load with just an IR with no filtering on each unit. So we'll hear the stack setting on the tube amp expander, and then we'll just hear the Captor. The tonal difference is far more pronounced there than it is between the respective combo and stack modes of the tube amp expander itself. I think this is probably because the tube amp expander is more accurately mimicking the impedance loading behavior of a real guitar speaker cabinet. In turn, it is changing the behavior of the amplifier and the way it's reacting to that. Whereas the Two Notes is using sort of like a bathtub shaped impedance curve, very similar to something like the Universal Audio aux. And that is a big divide when it comes to reactive load boxes. Not all reactive load boxes are built the same. Something like the tube amp expander or the Sir reactive load and the Fractal X load are going to have an impedance curve that looks a whole lot more like a real speaker cabinet, whereas the Two Notes, like I said, has this bathtub thing going on. And I will say that it doesn't mean that it's not usable. It doesn't mean that it sounds better or worse. It's just good keeping that in mind that, yeah, it's not accurate to the way a real world cabinet behaves, but you can get some very usable guitar tones out of it. So with that, let's continue with the Captor X. There is a voicing control on here next to the output level. There is also a space control on there. So the space control is going to be similar to the air level in the Waza tube amp expander. And then the voicing control, I think, is probably Two Notes' workaround for that impedance curve that they've got baked in here. So I'm just going to play around a little bit with those. Again, this is just the raw load and IR. So the voicing control there, as you turn it up from noon, really scoops out the mids, and it does the opposite. It turns the mid-range up as you sweep it to the left. I find that one is pretty drastic on there. It's not subtle like the difference between the stack and the combo on the tube amp expander, but the space control on there has a much more gradual sweep to it than the air control on the tube amp expander. I think with the tube amp expander air control around 9 o'clock, it was already starting to sound like a lot of room sound on there. With the space control on here, you can get it up to noon and it's not totally overblown on there. So it's a little more subtle there. Let's have a listen to a couple of different rigs that I've programmed in here, because I think one of the really cool features about the Captor X is there is a twin tracker control. So you can get a faux doubled guitar sound. And if you were going to be using this with headphones, together with the space control, together with things like the built-in reverb and EQ functionality that you can get with the software, I think it makes for a really pleasant experience on headphones. I'm not on headphones at the moment, I'm using studio monitors, but if you want to listen to it like it's on headphones, put some headphones on. So let's have a listen. Again, just where I am, I'm going to turn this air control back down so it's raw dogging it, then we will add the twin tracker. You also heard the twin tracker and the enhancer together at the end there. I think they are voiced really sweetly. They're very musical. And again, if you were playing at low volume or you were playing with headphones, they're going to add some dimension and some depth to the overall tone. In terms of working with both units, the overall control set is very similar, very immediate. And if you've got these programmed with the software and you're just going to twist some knobs and get immediate gratification, I think they both really work well in that regard. I just personally prefer the sound of the Boss, and I think it comes down to those accurate impedance characteristics, particularly on the stack setting. When I hear that and I play this amp, it behaves and reacts the way I expect it to when I'm playing it through a cabinet, whereas the two notes load, again, it's that kind of bathtub thing. It's not super accurate, doesn't mean that you can't get good sounds out of it. I just prefer the impedance characteristics of the Boss, which to me is the most important thing with something like this. Let's take a look at the software now and how you'd actually go about programming sounds. We've kind of already laid out the differences in the built-in effects and some of the other characteristics, so I'll keep this pretty short and sweet. This is the Torpedo Remote software to use with the Captor X. One of the most attractive things about the the Two Notes ecosystem are their Dyne IR packs. So you can select any two microphones over here and essentially move them around a virtual cabinet. So I'm going to put a Royer 121 right up against this virtual speaker. Let's hear that. I could then blend that with another microphone. For example, if we go over to mic B, I can select, say, a 421 dynamic microphone. I can move it around here. I can change the angle. So let's do this. Let's mute the 121 and dial in this 421. I've got access to EQ, the enhancer, and reverb in here. So if I activate the reverb, I've got a variety of different verbs from studios, cathedrals, springs, and plates. I really like the plate kind of for a smaller size over here and not too much mix. I also like using a little bit of post EQ on here. You know, we can add a low cut at around 80 Hertz, and we could add a little bit of a mid boost if we wanted on here somewhere around, say, 1 kilohertz. Let's do that. So we've got 1 dB of gain there without the EQ, and then with it. Alternatively, you could use this as an IR loader over here like I was doing loading up my free IR. This is going to take the place of the virtual microphones. And if you're like me and you have an IR that you just really like the sound of, that you pretty much use on everything, this works great. You still have the studio style options over here to process it with EQ, the enhancer, reverb, and the twin tracker. I also like that there's a gate built in over here, and you could blend different IRs and adjust their relative levels as well. The Boss software behaves in a very similar manner. The main cab mic page over here lets you select between a bunch of different built-in cabs, or alternatively, you can load your own IRs or use the built-in Celestion IRs over here. I like that extra little value add-on there, where if you don't own any existing IR packs, this comes with some high-quality Celestion IRs. But if you wanted to use the virtual mics in here, again, you can kind of move them around in a similar fashion to the Two Notes software. It's slightly more limited in the number of positions that you have over here. You can see there's some discrete positions for the overall position and for the distance here. But let's just hear this 421 style microphone. I can also blend it with another microphone in there. Alternatively, if you want to use this as an IR loader, you can load two different IRs and set their respective levels along with the phase relationship over there. You've also got this mix assist feature over here, which gives you 3 discrete modes on here along with a transient control. So let's just have a listen to what each of these does. This is a really interesting control. You can also change the air feel from different studio types over here, but I'll just give it to you raw, and then we'll kick in the Type 1 mix assist. That's essentially the boss way of doing what's happening with the enhancer and the post EQ in the 2 notes. You can come over to the editor over here, and this is where you've got access to the compressor, the delay, and the reverb. So you can see that there's multiple delay types over here: single, pan, stereo, analog, and SDE 3000. We heard the SDE 3000 earlier. There's a couple of different reverb types in here: 2 halls, a plate, 2 rooms, and a spring style reverb. This whole editor kind of mimics what you'd see on like the Boss GT1000 in terms of the effect selection and the way that you tweak them. I like that the compressor gives you a bunch of options in here. So you've got rack 160D and vintage rack. You can set them up as limiters as well. So this is kind of interesting. If I roll my volume control down, I go for more of a chimey style thing over here. You'd hear the limiter kicking in there when I was playing a little bit too heavy and I had the level too high on there. So you can set this to more conservative ratios over here, but I think as a utility, it's kind of designed just to take out those transient spikes. You've then also got line EQ, which can be a parametric or a graphic EQ over here. So similar to the EQ in the 2 notes over there, you can add a low cut and a high cut and do some mid-range EQing as well. You can also link this with the speaker line link. So if you are using one of the extra features on the tube amp expander, the 30-watt power amp, basically to reamp this, you can also either independently have your front of house signal EQ'd and sweetened and leave the speaker output dry, or you can apply the same high and low cut to the speaker cab on there, which is a nice little feature. I like that they are linked in there over there. So we just have a listen to what this would do over here. I've got an 80 hertz low cut and 8 kilohertz high cut on there, and I'll just go back to cranking this Les Paul. Another feature that the Boss has is an effects loop, and you can choose to activate this from the software. So if you had a delay or reverb pedal that you really like the sound of, or if your existing amplifier doesn't have an effects loop, you can essentially add one using the tube amp expander. That's another really nice factor that you want to keep in mind if you're trying to choose between these two. It's worth noting that if you buy a Captor X, you also get a license for 2 Note's excellent Genome software. I've got a demo video with Genome. It's an all-in-one modeler and effects player. You can even play and load NAMM profiles in it. So that is something to consider as well with this. That's a really great value add where you could use this along with the Genome software and get access to a whole bunch of other features. I should also mention as well, we strictly looked at these as loads to replace a guitar cabinet, but if you were using a real guitar cabinet, then the Captor X has a speaker through, and in that situation, you would be getting the speaker cabinet providing the load on your amplifier. So you'd get the authentic load from your cabinet on the speaker cab there. That's just something to note. It's not something that I wanted to have a look at today because yes, this does have an attenuator with 3 modes, and yes, you can use the speaker through, and it differs to this, which has a 30-watt power amplifier. So the actual, I guess, accuracy of the load is of critical importance with the tube amp expander on here. The fact that the tube amp expander has an effects loop on here, I think is great if you're going to be using this with, say, an old non-master volume Fender, Marshall, or Vox. It could let you run your delays or your reverbs after your main source of distortion on there. I really like the form factor of both of these as well. I think being able to sit them on top of your amp, either in the studio or playing live, is super convenient. And I think that you just have to kind of weigh up the advantages between the different features on here. I know in Australia, this is a little bit more expensive than this one, but you know, you do get the effects loop, you do get the built-in power amp on here. If you wanted to use this as a standalone power amp, say for your digital modeler, that would be another feature that you could make use of on here. We also heard the tonal comparison strictly as reactive load boxes on there. I think I'm just so used to using my amplifier with either a very accurate reactive load like the Fractal X load or running it into a cabinet. But that stack setting on here just is immediate gratification on there. But I think you can get slightly closer using some of the features like the voicing control on the Captor X. But if you wanted a really accurate load, I know 2Notes have just released their Reload 2, which in their words has a Celestion approved load. I think that is code for it just looks a lot more like a typical speaker impedance curve on there. For now though, I want to hear from all of you. Do you own either of these? Do you own a reactive load box? Are you in the market for a reactive load box? And was this video useful? I'll put links to both products in the video description if you want to check them out. Or if you want to support me directly, there's links to my Patreon and the music that I make with my band Ragdoll. Go and make some glorious guitar noises, and I'll see you on the next one.